Hi, welcome students. We are now starting the new lesson Principles of Inheritance and Variation. We have already learnt about inheritance in our previous classes. Today we shall discuss regarding Mendel that he was the pioneer in performing the experiment of hybridization on pea plant. Mendel was treated or he was declared as father of genetics because of his findings of the experiment of hybridization on pea plant, and that paved the way for the new branch of biology called genetics. So, pea plant was selected by Mendel on the basis that there was the variation in the characteristics that he found in the pea plant. Some of them were tall, some were dwarf, some had red colored flower, some had white colored flower, some had wrinkled seeds, some had round seeds. The cotyledons were green and yellow. So these were the contrasting characters that Mendel found in the observation of pea plants, and he was really astonished why such a difference in the characteristic was found. So he was lucky enough in selecting the pea plants for his hybridization experiment. The pea plant Mendel selected were the true breeding plants. If we are talking of these true breeding plants, it means if the plant or if a seed of the pea plant is collected by Mendel and was sown, it grew into the plant. Now the plant will produce flower, no doubt, and that flower was allowed to self pollinate, or it was allowed for self fertilization. By this self fertilization, the next generation seeds were developed, and these seeds, when grown, they were having the same characteristics of its parental generation. So this experiment was repeated for several generations, and he found there was no any deviation in the characteristics as was found in the parental generation. Such breed or the plant of that Mendel selected was declared as true breeding plant. Mendel performed his experiments, and what was the finding that he could observe? He published it, but his published work remained unnoticed for 34 years due to limited circulation of the proceedings of Natural Science Society in which it was published. He could not convince himself about his conclusion being universal, since Mendel failed to reproduce the result on hawk wheat undertaken on the suggestions of Nageli. Uh, Let us first discuss about the experiment that Mendel performed. Mendel selected the parents first, and he found that seven pairs of contrasting character were observed. For the monohybrid cross that Mendel performed, this cross is said to be the monohybrid cross because he took only one pair of contrasting character. For example, he selected the tall plant and the dwarf plant, and when he crossed these two, the first generation offsprings were produced, and these all offsprings were tall. He then uh, sent for these F1 plants for self fertilization. Self cross of the F1 plants were allowed to happen, and he found that there was a deviation in the characteristic from the first generation plant, and that second generation had 3 is to 1 ratio of its characteristics that was observed. 3 tall plants were produced and 1 dwarf plant. That is 75% of the plants produced by the selfing of F1 generation plants were tall, and 1 plant was a dwarf. So, the explanation of this given by Mendel was that the F1 progeny, which were 100% tall, had the alleles, that was the factor present in the tall plant and dwarf plant, and both the factors for the height of the plant, that is the tall factor and the dwarf factor, came into the progeny of F1 generation. These two progenies remain in the F1 plants. They coexisted, but they couldn't interblend. There was no any intermixing of these factors, and when the F1 progeny was self crossed, it was found that the characters were separated. 75% of them were the tall plant, and the remaining 25% was dwarf. So, from this experiment, Mendel could conclude that the gametes are always pure, which they segregate during the time of formation of gametes. And the second was the law of dominance, because the tall and dwarf factors for tall and dwarf, both the factors were present in the individual, but the individual was tall. It is because the dominant factor for the height of the plant was able to express itself, whereas the factor for the dwarfness couldn't express. That's why both the factors, even if were present, only one factor for the tallness could express itself, so it was the law of dominance. We shall discuss the remaining part in the next video. Thank you.